At a massive factory, a black janitor quietly mopped the floors, her mind heavy with hospital bills and looming deportation. But behind her worn gloves was a gifted mechanic. So when a vital machine broke and engineers panicked, she humbly stepped in and fixed it. Then, without waiting for praise, she rushed to the hospital to care for her sick son. What she didn't know was that a powerful man had been watching, and was about to make a decision that would rewrite her life in ways she never dared to dream. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. At 11:38 p.m., Clarice was still awake, not at home, because home was a rented room with mold in the walls and a lock that stuck when it rained. She sat instead in a vinyl chair by a hospital bed, her spine curved in exhaustion, her coat still zipped because she never intended to stay long. But she always stayed. A beep echoed softly. Machines pulsed beside her. And on the bed lay her son, Jalen, 10 years old, frail, dark-skinned, his chest rising unevenly beneath the thin hospital blanket. His heart had been faulty since birth, and no one could explain why a child with so much light behind his eyes had to carry so much pain in his chest. Clarice reached out and adjusted the nasal tube, her hands trembling not from fatigue, but from the fear that had become her shadow. This was her reality. No husband, no relatives close enough to help, no insurance that covered everything, no green card that gave her any rights if anyone chose to ask questions, just her and him. Her job as a janitor barely paid enough to keep the medication flowing, and still, it was a miracle she even had it. She'd forged paperwork months ago just to sneak him into a better coverage bracket. A desperate act, one mistake away from discovery, one ICE officer away from being ripped apart. At 4:30, ma'am, her shift hadn't even started yet, but Clarice was already on her way, walking 2 blocks in the snow to catch the earliest bus across town. Newark's winter was unforgiving, especially for a woman who barely had time to sleep, let alone thaw her fingers. By 5:12, she arrived at the back gate of Magnetic Dynamics Corp., a massive steel and circuit manufacturing plant. Most employees wouldn't arrive for another hour. She, as always, was first. There was no applause for the woman who mopped the oil-stained floors before daylight. No thank you for the toilets scrubbed spotless in the men's locker room. Just the soft squeak of her boots and the keys that jingled softly at her hip. She wore a gray uniform 2 sizes too big and a knitted cap pulled low over her brow. Her face was lined. Not from age alone, but from years of holding her breath around immigration officers, of dodging questions, of silencing her brilliance so it wouldn't threaten anyone. Yet despite it all, her eyes still held fire. Because Clarice used to be someone. Back home in Trinidad, she wasn't a janitor. She was a certified mechanic, known in her village as the engine whisperer. She had hands that understood machines better than most men who'd trained for years. But none of that mattered here. Not after her visa was denied renewal. Not after she was forced to take what work she could to survive. Survival now meant invisibility. It meant nodding politely when the young engineers walked past without seeing her. It meant never correcting anyone, never drawing attention, never doing too well at anything. And yet, as she passed the R12 unit, the largest machine in the west wing of the plant, she paused. The hum was off. It was subtle, not something anyone else would notice, but Clarice noticed. She always did. She adjusted her mop, glancing quickly over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Then she crouched down near the base, pretending to clean. Her fingers, hidden by rubber gloves, grazed the steel casing near the intake valve. A faint warmth, too soon, too hot. Her stomach tightened. She scribbled a note on the back of a cleaning schedule. R12, valve fluctuation, check before next cycle. But she knew it wouldn't be read. No one read notes from the janitor. As the factory lights blinked on and machines coughed to life, Clarice moved like a shadow between shadows, mopping, wiping, disappearing. No one noticed the tired curve in her shoulders, or how she cradled her side when she bent to scrub the floor, or that every 15 minutes she checked the time, not for a break, but to count down to when she'd ride the bus back to the hospital, where her real world existed. The world where her son still smiled at her through tubes, where she read him science books and tucked tiny blankets around his legs, where she prayed every night that she'd make it one more week without being fired, arrested, or worse. And yet, even here, in the humming underbelly of a company that barely knew her name, Clarice kept a kind of grace. She fixed what she could. She smiled when someone bumped her in the hallway. She hummed old calypso songs while polishing the chrome edges of the machines, and she never, ever let them see the fear behind her eyes. Not yet. Because a moment was coming. A moment when the machine would fail, and everything would depend on someone seeing what she saw. And when that moment came, Clarice would be ready. One machine. One woman no one believes. And one CEO watching from the shadows. By the time the morning shift flooded the floor, the factory had shaken off its sleep. Bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp reflections on every cold surface. The smell of lubricant, old metal, and anticipation filled the air. Somewhere in the growing noise of production, a sudden change sliced through. The low rumble of a machine sputtered and went silent. It was the R12. The plant's main artery had stalled, and in that moment the silence felt louder than the siren that never came. At first, no one panicked. Engineers stepped in quickly, their white collars slightly wrinkled from rushed arrivals, typing frantically into terminals. Valves were rechecked, lines retightened. A half-dozen voices overlapped, codes, readings, electrical jargon. Yet the error lights kept blinking red, a stubborn pulse of impending disaster. The R12 wasn't just another machine. It was the key to a $7 million contract, due to ship in less than 2 days. From the mezzanine, Clarice stood still, mop in hand. She'd been cleaning the safety railings when the commotion began. Her eyes narrowed the moment she saw the panel flicker. The same panel she'd silently watched for weeks. She had warned herself not to get involved. It wasn't her place. But something pulled at her, a sense of knowing, of duty, of truth she could not unsee. She stepped down cautiously, weaving through startled workers until she neared the engineers. "Excuse me," she said, barely above the noise. One of the younger men glanced at her without real attention. "This area's off limits," he snapped, turning back to his tablet. She paused, measured her breath, and spoke again. "The intake valve, it's stuck. If the system resets now, it'll burn the secondary line." Her voice was calm, but inside her chest everything screamed. They laughed, reflexively, thoughtlessly, not in cruelty, but in disbelief. A janitor offering advice on the most complex machine in the facility? It was absurd. And yet, her gaze did not falter. Her voice didn't shake. "Just give me 2 minutes," she said quietly. "You're about to lose more than time." One of them looked unsure, but before anyone could speak, the floor manager appeared. Rudd was a large man, older, with a walk that suggested he'd been there longer than anyone else. He scanned her uniform, unimpressed. "You're custodial staff. You're not certified to touch that unit." Clarice met his eyes. No fear, no defiance, just truth. "I'm not asking to touch it," she said. "I'm asking to try." If I'm wrong, you lose nothing, but if I'm right, we save the plant." A heavy pause lingered in the air. With a scoff and a wave of his hand, Rudd relented. "Fine, let the janitor have a go. Maybe we all need the laugh." The engineers stepped back. Clarice approached the R-12, her heartbeat pounding like a second engine in her ears. She crouched low beside the auxiliary panel, fingers moving with confident precision. She spotted the melted wire cluster hidden near the intake, exactly what she feared. She pulled a zip tie from her coat pocket, a trick from long ago, and rerouted the circuit. Her hands worked fast, but not rushed, as if she were restoring something sacred. Then, reaching beneath the base, she toggled the manual reset. The machine shuddered, sputtered once, then roared. Green lights spread across the panel. Stabilized, online, full pressure. The entire floor seemed to inhale and exhale at once. Cheers broke out, soft at first, then louder. One of the engineers clapped. Someone patted her on the back. For a moment she felt seen, but only for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered almost to herself. Then she turned quickly, tugging her gloves on and walking toward the hallway. No one asked why she was in such a hurry. No one knew she had only 15 minutes to make the next bus to the hospital. But someone was watching. Behind the observation glass stood a man in a dark wool coat, hands folded across his chest, no badge, no clipboard, just stillness, and eyes that missed nothing. Thomas Weller, the CEO. He'd come quietly that day, curious about rumors of a woman who fixed more than she claimed. He'd expected whispers. What he witnessed was revelation. He watched Clarice disappear around the corner, her gray coat catching the light one last time, and in that moment something settled heavily in his chest. A blend of guilt, wonder, and realization. Someone extraordinary had been standing in plain sight, and no one had truly seen her. Until now. Until him. A CEO in disguise, a quiet hospital hallway, and the moment a woman's secret life becomes impossible to ignore. Thomas Weller didn't say a word as Clarice disappeared down the corridor. He didn't call out, didn't ask anyone who she was. He simply turned, adjusted the scarf at his collar, and quietly followed, keeping far enough to stay unnoticed, close enough to stay connected. There was something in the way she moved, swift but burdened, as if each step carried years of stories she never got to tell. And something inside him, long dormant, told him he needed to know them. She exited the factory without fanfare, blending into the dull gray morning like a ghost that belonged to the cold. No car, no ride waiting, just a city bus stop on a slush-covered corner where she stood with arms folded, breath fogging in short, silent puffs. Thomas watched from a discreet distance in his sedan, the wipers brushing away frost as she boarded the bus. He didn't hesitate. He followed. They passed shuttered diners, chain-linked fences, broken neon signs flickering above pawn shops. 35 minutes later, she got off near Newark General Hospital, her steps faster now, more urgent. Thomas parked down the street, pulled his coat tighter, and walked into the lobby just moments after her. She didn't head for the ER or any front desk. She knew exactly where she was going. Up the elevator, hallway to the right, room 327. Through a narrow sliver of window, Thomas saw her stop just outside the door. Clarice adjusted her coat, smoothed her sleeves. Then, with a breath so deep it made her shoulders tremble, she stepped inside. What he saw next made him freeze in place. Inside the room, under dim hospital light, a small boy lay curled on a bed, wires taped to his chest, an oxygen tube beneath his nose, skin pale like paper. She sat beside him, pulling a thermos from her bag. Clarice's entire posture softened. The strength she carried at the factory melted into something even more powerful, love. She stirred the spoon gently, blowing over it before holding it to the boy's lips. "Warm, baby. Just like you like it," she whispered. Her voice was lower, gentler than Thomas had heard, filled with music, patience, and a kind of grace no boardroom had ever taught him. He stepped back, not wanting to intrude but unable to leave. When she began talking to the boy about the R12, his eyes lit up faintly. "You fixed it?" he asked, his voice weak but filled with pride. "I helped," she said, smiling with a flicker of mischief. "But I had to leave fast before the machines got jealous." They both giggled, and for a moment it was just a mother and son in a world they had carved out of pain and survival, stitched together with faith and stories. Later, after the boy dozed off, Clarice sat by the window, staring at the dark clouds outside. She pulled out a crumpled envelope from her coat and looked at it silently. Thomas couldn't see the contents, but he knew that kind of envelope. Legal paper, government ink, and the way she stared at it, like it was both a threat and a goodbye, told him enough. Her visa, her forged insurance, her job. He left the hallway, made a call, and within 2 hours had 2 names on retainer, a top immigration attorney and a healthcare fraud defense specialist. He didn't ask her permission. He didn't need to, because now he knew. She wasn't just the woman who saved his machine. She was the woman holding together an entire world, alone, quietly, brilliantly. And if no one else was going to fight for her, he would. That night, he returned to the office and pulled up her employment file. It was thin, bare, a paper wall built by blind protocol. But buried in a past application folder was a detail. Clarice had once applied for a junior technician role. Denied, of course, wrong documentation, no formal referrals. One note in the margin. Highly knowledgeable, likely overstating experience. Thomas closed the file, jaw tight. Overstating? They had no idea. The next morning, Clarice found an envelope in her locker. Inside, a personal letter from the CEO signed in blue ink. A request. No, an invitation to join the company's certified technical apprenticeship program with full pay and protected status while legal matters were handled. At first, she froze. Then read it again, then again. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself, and when no one was looking, she wiped her cheek with the back of her gloved hand. That evening she returned to room 327. Her son stirred awake, his eyes still heavy. "Mama?" he mumbled. Clarice bent low, her voice trembling now. "Guess what, baby? Mama's going back to school." He smiled in his sleep, and she kissed his forehead. Not every miracle needs thunder. Some come quietly, like folded letters in cold lockers, or strangers who finally look up and see you. A rising star, a jealous man, and the storm that follows when light dares to shine too brightly. The letter changed everything. Within months, Clarice went from invisible to indispensable. The apprenticeship program embraced her like a secret finally spoken aloud. Her test scores shattered benchmarks. Her hands moved with grace and certainty, earning silent nods from even the most skeptical engineers. She never flaunted her skills. She simply delivered. And one by one, those who once passed her by in hallways now paused to ask questions, then leaned in to hear her answers. By the end of the year, Clarice had risen to lead a pilot team tasked with redesigning outdated machinery for higher efficiency. It was her idea to recalibrate the coil flow, her blueprint that shaved 12% off the energy cost of the R series. Her name began appearing in email threads, then in internal newsletters, and finally on a project plaque. But while recognition bloomed around her, not everyone celebrated. Some saw her rise not as inspiration, but as a threat. Rudd, the floor manager who once waved her off with a smirk, watched in silence as she entered rooms he once ruled. His name no longer sat at the top of every meeting agenda. Clarice wasn't rude to him, she was polite, professional, and that somehow made it worse. She didn't seek revenge, didn't gloat. She simply outgrew the space he thought she belonged in. And he, bitter, overlooked, and increasingly insecure, began to plot. It started small, a misplaced folder, a meeting she missed because her invite was accidentally left off the list, but it didn't stop her. So he dug deeper. He accessed her digital files after hours. Then one Friday evening, he submitted a report to corporate security, accusing Clarice of leaking internal schematics to a rival firm. Attached was an email chain with attached blueprints and her name in the metadata. It looked damning. It was designed to. The news hit the factory like a tremor. Clarice was summoned, stunned, to an internal investigation room. Her hands were steady, but her voice broke slightly as she said, "That file isn't mine. I didn't send anything." She recognized the drawing. It was hers. But the message chain? Fabricated. Her project team froze. Some whispered doubts. Others looked away. She was suspended, pending review. And once again, Clarice walked out of the factory. But this time, not by choice. That night, she didn't go to the hospital first. She went home, sat at her tiny table with a cup of cold tea and every notebook she had filled over the last year. Page by page, she retraced every line of code, every adjustment, every timestamp. Then she remembered. The third-floor lab had a security cam, and on the day of the alleged email leak, she'd worked from the R&D annex alone, except Rudd had entered briefly, said nothing, just looked around, then left. She filed a request for access, citing the investigation. 2 days later, she sat with the footage in front of the review board. There he was, copying her notes from a workstation while glancing over his shoulder. It was quiet, chilling. Proof, and when she presented it, her voice was calm, not angry, just tired. "This isn't about ambition," she said, looking at them. "It's about truth, and who gets believed." The board exonerated her. Rudd was terminated. Some apologized, most stayed silent. Clarice returned to her team without ceremony, picked up her tools and resumed her work. But something had shifted, not just in her peers, but in the way she stood, taller, not louder but stronger. She had fought to be seen, and now even the shadows knew her name. And yet, as headlines about her vindication circulated internally, Clarice asked for none of the spotlight. Instead, she sent a quiet memo to Thomas Weller, requesting a meeting, not to report, not to accuse, but to propose an idea. "There are other women like me," she wrote, "who never even get to the door. Let's build a new door. A proposal. A legacy. And a woman who chooses to rise, not just for herself, but for those still waiting in the dark." Thomas Weller read Clarice's memo 3 times. It wasn't long, barely a page, but it carried more weight than any quarterly report he'd reviewed all year. She wasn't asking for a raise, not even a promotion. She wanted a program, a gateway, a way to bring in more women like her. Immigrants, single mothers, overlooked talents with nowhere to go but down unless someone pulled them up. And what struck him most was the way she signed it, with gratitude and with hope for those who come next. The meeting was brief. In his office overlooking the skyline, Clarice stood in the same gray coat she always wore. She didn't sit until he insisted. Her tone was respectful but unwavering. She laid out the outline: a technical training scholarship for women from underserved communities, a support fund for children needing critical care, and a mentorship circle run by current employees. "We have the space," she said. "We just need to fill it with light." Thomas said yes. Immediately, without hesitation. 3 months later, the factory floor looked different, not in paint or machines, but in energy. There were new faces, young women, older women, women in headscarves with different skin tones and accents and backstories, some nervous, some curious, all determined. They entered with uncertainty and left each day taller. Clarice became their guide, not their boss, not their savior, but their proof that someone like them could belong here, could thrive. She was offered an executive role with a corner office and company car. She declined the title, accepted the office, and quietly requested that half the space be turned into a resource room for trainees. When asked by reporters why she refused public recognition, she smiled and said, "Because the real work doesn't need a spotlight, it just needs to be done." But inside her drawer, she kept the very first blueprint she ever drew at the plant, creased, stained, and pressed. Clarice didn't seek revenge against Rudd. When asked if she'd press charges, she shook her head. "We don't grow by dragging others down, we grow by lifting others up," she said. Instead, she proposed adding a unit on workplace ethics to the apprenticeship curriculum. That was her justice, not punishment but prevention. Not erasing the past, but changing the future, and in doing so, she became more than a story. She became a standard. The following spring, a new building opened across from the factory. The Clarice Project, Center for Technical Empowerment and Pediatric Care. Inside, children received treatment while their mothers studied in classrooms next door. Clarice stood quietly at the ribbon cutting, her son Jalen, stronger now, smiling, at her side. When the crowd applauded, she took a step back, letting others stand in the front row. She looked toward the balcony where a group of young women in navy uniforms stood, beaming. One of them waved. Clarice waved back. That night, as the sun melted behind the smokestacks and the street lamps flickered to life, Clarice stood by the window of her small office and watched the students pour out of the center. They walked in groups, laughing, holding notebooks, some stopping to adjust their toolkits. In their stride was the confidence she once had to build in silence. In their eyes was the fire she once had to hide. Now it burned freely. She turned to Jalen, now 13 and curious. "Mama?" he asked. "Was it worth it?" She smiled, brushing her fingers across his cheek. "Every scraped knee, every silent night, every step I thought no one saw, it was worth it for this." And as they locked up the lights and walked toward the parking lot, mother and son together, the legacy she built followed them, not in stone or salary, but in people, in possibility, in light. But maybe not really the end. Because somewhere in another quiet room, another woman is dreaming with calloused hands and a bright mind, just waiting for someone to believe in her too.